Welcome to another Bite of History. We are starting a new series. We're going to call this series England in America. We will start out with this first lesson talking about England delayed for a century. Spain has been busy in the Americas ever since 1492 with Columbus's voyage. England, other than sending John Cabot to sail around Newfoundland, England has not been involved in exploration or colonization in the Americas. But Queen Elizabeth of England, once she gains control of England and England begins to mature politically and economically, she will be interested in getting started making an English presence in North America. The reason that England was delayed for almost 100 years was because of power struggles in England. England was a fairly new country on the European scene, and during this time period between 1492 and 1585, England was struggling with kings and their power and tied to religion. In Europe, all of Europe was Christian, from the west coast to the steppes of Asia, including Russia to the east, and of course England and France, Spain and Portugal to the west. But all of Europe was Christian. And if you were Christian, you were Catholic. The word Catholic means universal. So the universal church of Christianity was the Catholic Church. Until 1517, when a monk in the German city-state of Wittenberg begins to study the scriptures and begins to realize that over the centuries that the Catholic doctrine has deviated from what he saw from the original church in the apostles and disciples in Jesus' day. So Martin Luther begins writing up a list of ways in which the Catholic Church needed to reform itself. Luther had no intention of leaving the Catholic Church or of creating a reformation. But he wrote up these 95 theses and tacked it to the church door there in Wittenberg. Now, the reason he tacked it to the church door is because everybody went to church, and it served as a type of bulletin board so that everybody could see his suggestions about needed reform in the church, in Christianity. When word got to Rome, to the Pope sent his men to capture Martin Luther, to bring him to Rome to stand trial for preaching heresy or false doctrine. But the Prince of Wittenberg liked Luther, and he took him in his castle and protected him from being arrested by the Pope's men. The Pope excommunicated Luther, and if he had been able to capture Luther and have him brought to Rome, Luther would have been executed. But Luther didn't get to Rome, and he escaped the Pope's men and began to spread his ideas about getting back to the originality of the teachings of Jesus and the apostles. Most of the northern city-states, which included most of Central Europe, followed Luther's ideas, and they would be called Lutherans, as followers of Luther. Now, not all of those that turned to Luther's teachings were religiously converted, but rather they were tired of sending tribute to Rome. Being a Christian country, every Christian country had to send tribute to Rome. A lot of the land in each country was owned by the church. So a lot of the wealth of these different countries was going out of the country and into Rome. So a lot of these princes and city-state rulers withdrew from the Catholic Church, followed Luther's teachings, and therefore they got out of having to send tribute and tithes to Rome. Then, a few years after Luther started what would be called the Protestant Reformation, another man got on board, believing that Luther hadn't taken things as far as he should have towards the original teachings of Christ. His main name was John Calvin, and he began teaching. In fact, he wrote a book talking about his view on what Christianity should be, what it should be teaching. And if you look at the map on the PowerPoint, it shows the different countries of Europe, those that converted to Lutheranism, those that converted to Calvinism, and those that remained Catholic. Now, the majority, as you can see on the map, those that are in green, remained Catholic. And a few years after the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church would begin a reform movement of its own to try to reform itself. During this time period, wherever you were in the world, there was no real freedom, definitely no religious freedom. So whatever religion the king or the prince, or in the Italian city-states, the doges, mayors of the cities, whatever they were, everybody in the area had to follow that same religion. So in Wittenberg, which was a city-state of Central Europe, everybody had to practice Lutheranism. While in England and the Netherlands, they followed Calvin's teaching and they became Calvinists. Now, England, originally being Catholic, under Henry VIII, King Henry VIII, who reigned from 1509 to 1547, he was so strongly Catholic that he had written an essay that was published defending the Catholic faith. And this was in 1521 when he wrote this essay, and it was published. And the Pope was so impressed with it that he called Henry VIII Defender of the Faith. Gave him that title, Defender of the Faith. But Henry VIII was a man of very lusty appetites. As you can see from his picture on the PowerPoint in the bottom left-hand corner, he had a large appetite for food, also for entertainment and for women. So shortly after 1521, within the next 10 years, Henry VIII got into a struggle with the Pope. Henry VIII had originally married Catherine of Aragon. She was a Spanish princess and very strongly Catholic. But as Henry's first wife, Catherine did not produce a son. She had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Mary, but no sons. And so Henry VIII wants to get rid of Catherine and get a new wife. And in fact, he already had one in mind, one that he'd been eyeing, and he was wanting to make her his wife, but he had to get rid of Catherine. Well, in order to marry Catherine, Henry VIII had to go to the Pope and ask permission to marry Catherine, because Catherine was the widow of Henry's brother. And according to the Catholic Church, it was incest to marry your brother's wife. So Henry VIII went to the Pope and asked for special dispensation to be able to marry Catherine. Well, now he's wanting to get rid of her, and he has to go back to the Pope, and as chance would have it, there's a new Pope. The Pope that had given him permission to marry Catherine had died, and now there's a new Pope. So when Henry goes to him and he says, look, I know I did wrong by marrying my brother's widow. I want to repent. And I want my marriage to be annulled because I'm sorry for my sin, and I want my marriage annulled. Well, the Pope, the new Pope, is between a rock and a hard place. If the Pope allowed Henry to divorce Catherine, he would in essence be saying that the previous Pope erred. And of course, the popes are supposed to be infallible. So, even though he didn't want to anger Henry because he had all these other countries that are withdrawing from the Catholic Church, he doesn't want to lose England as well. But he makes the hard choice, and he tells Henry that he cannot give him permission to divorce Catherine. So Henry goes back to England, and he is pouting, he's moping around, he's depressed. And the Archbishop of Canterbury told Henry, he said, look, Henry, look at these other countries that have withdrawn from the Catholic Church. They don't have to do what the Pope says anymore. So just withdraw from the Catholic Church and you can do what you want to. So 13 years after Henry was named Defender of the Faith, he took England out of the Catholic Church and created the Church of England and made himself, Henry VIII, supreme head of the church. So now he is in the place of the Pope himself, and he can divorce Catherine and marry his next wife. That's in 1534 that he creates the Church of England. Henry will eventually go through 6 different wives. Some of them he divorces, some he imprisons in the Tower of London, some of them he simply gets rid of by murder. But at any rate, the Church of England has now been created. No longer England is in the Catholic Church. Now, Henry was not religiously converted, so as far as he's concerned, the Church of England can be exactly like the Catholic Church, only without the Pope. So begins England's problems in religious and political power struggles. Henry did eventually have one son, Edward VI, but he was a very sickly baby, and he would become king when he was 9 years old, but he was a very precocious 9-year-old, very mature for his age. He would reign from 1547 to 1553. He was fiercely Protestant. His mother and her family, his maternal uncles, were very strongly Calvinist. So Edward was raised to be very fiercely Protestant. So during Edward's reign, short reign, he would only, he died when he was 15, so he only reigned 6 years. But during his 6 years, the Church of England became more Protestant, more Calvinist, while under Henry it had maintained most of its Catholic elements. But under Edward's short reign, a lot of those Catholic elements began to disappear. But then Edward V died, and his older sister Mary became queen. She would reign from 1553 to 1558, a short 5 years. Thankfully for Protestants in England, because she set about trying to restore the Catholic Church and to kill off the Protestants. As far as records are concerned, she put to death at least 300 Protestants during her 5-year reign. But she died, natural causes, and her sister Elizabeth became Queen of England. Elizabeth would reign from 1558 to 1603, and she would restore the Church of England to Protestantism. But under Elizabeth's reign, there was no persecution of Catholics, but Calvinist teachings, Calvinist doctrine became very much a part of the Church of England. England had a constitutional monarchy, which means that the king was, his power was limited by law, meaning that Parliament held a lot of power in government in England, and they established law. Going all the way back to the Magna Carta in 1215, which guaranteed the barons or the landowners certain rights and privileges. And ever since that time, 1215, kings had had to sign similar kinds of petitions guaranteeing that they would honor those rights and privileges. During Elizabeth's reign, those privileges would be granted to not only the aristocracy but also to the gentry. Aristocracy were those that were titled dukes, earls, viscounts, but the gentry were those who were wealthy, like bankers, lawyers, businessmen, who were considered part of the gentry. And Parliament was made up of two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Lords, in order to be a member of the House of Lords, you had to be titled. You had to be part of the aristocracy. House of Commons, you could be a commoner and hold office or have a seat in the House of Commons. So during Elizabeth's reign, most of the men in the House of Commons were Calvinist. So the law in England was very much influenced by Calvinist teaching. And if you look at the PowerPoint, you'll see images of Edward the Sixth, Mary Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth. Also shows an image in the lower left-hand corner of what was happening during Bloody Mary's reign, when people were burned at the stake for being anti-Catholic. The other image in the right-hand corner is an image of life in Elizabethan England. Under Elizabeth, England came to maturity, national maturity. Economically sound, politically secure. Elizabeth built the British Navy using the latest in technology and shipbuilding, a superior navy. Up until that time, Spain had the largest and the most powerful navy in the world. But for 100 years, those ships had been sailing back and forth across the Atlantic from the Americas, bringing gold and silver and other items into Spain. So Spain's ships were getting up in age, and also they were the big, cumbersome galleons. Couldn't really hold a candle now to Elizabeth's navy. There were several men that were favorites of Elizabeth that were called her sea dogs. Men like Sir Francis Drake, Sir Charles Frobisher, and on the PowerPoint you can see images of the four men who were considered Elizabeth's sea dogs. So Sir Francis Drake, Sir Charles Frobisher, Sir Walter Raleigh, and Gilbert Humphrey. They were captains of ships, English ships, that sailed with a letter of marque, meaning that they had the Queen's permission to stop Spanish ships and to capture their gold and silver that they were transporting back to Spain from the Americas. So they were, of course, according to Spain, they were considered pirates. But especially Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh really harassed Spanish shipping, sometimes taking the ships, sometimes destroying the ships, but taking all of the wealth from those ships and taking it back to England to Elizabeth. Now the men themselves would get a portion of the wealth, the gold, silver, and other things that they were bringing. They would get a portion, but most of it would go to England's treasury. Now, Elizabeth is called the Virgin Queen, whether that means literally she was a virgin or because she never married. Elizabeth said that she was married to England. Her foreign policy and the idea of her marrying was all tied up with her foreign policy. She knew that most marriages among the royalty of Europe were political alliances. And Elizabeth wanted to keep England out of war, out of conflict, in order for England to continue to progress economically. But in 1585, Spain is becoming fed up with all of those British privateers or pirates capturing Spanish ships. Also, the Netherlands had converted to Calvinism, but they belonged to Spain. They were the Spanish Netherlands. And they sought for independence from Spain. They wanted to get out from under the Catholic ruler of Spain. So the Netherlands and Spain are at war. And Elizabeth feels that as England is the next door neighbor of another Protestant country, that she should help out the Netherlands. So Much against her will, England becomes involved in war with Spain. This war will be called the War of the Spanish Armada. You see on this next slide, you can see maps of the Spanish ships as they sailed to England. Also, the formation in which the Spanish ships sailed, that is a armada, a crescent, with the admiral ship in the middle protected by all the other ships around it. This War of the Spanish Armada was considered by Europeans to be the battle between David and Goliath. Remember, all of Europe is Christian, and their lives revolve around the church and Christian teachings. And the story of David and Goliath in the Old Testament, where David, a shepherd boy, Israelite, goes up against a giant, Philistine, and who is 9 or 10 feet tall, and David is able to slay the giant. So Spain is considered the giant, and England, just a small island nation, new to the European scene, is considered to be David. So it's the battle between David and Goliath. Many people in Europe, if you read primary documents during the time period, talk about it as a possible war to end all wars, the Battle of Armageddon. So it is talked about in those terms in the newspapers, in personal letters, this battle between Spain and Britain. Britain's ships are smaller, faster, also captained by very experienced young men, and to make a long story short, and a very interesting story, Spain was troubled by disease, sickness, and just as they were ready to enter the English Channel, a hurricane struck and blew many of the Spanish ships totally off course, and they never even saw battle. But the British won the War of the Spanish Armada, and that was in 1588, and ever since that time, Spain has receded in power and prestige among European countries. It went from being the wealthiest, strongest country in Europe to being a second-rate country. Thank you for listening. Don't forget, there is information below, and if you haven't subscribed, please do, so that you'll know when we put our next video online.
Thank you, and come back.
Yes.